All right, so hi everyone. My name is Sam Glinksy. I'm with TxDOT's maintenance division, the maintenance field support section, which is also known as the vegetation management section. When Iris asked me to do a case study or something of that sort, I sort of thought back on what was the most difficult or complex part of the whole enrollment and application process for us. And I think one of the things was determining what land to enroll and adopt, sort of the conceptual part of that, as well as the actual process for how you can determine that. So that's mostly what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, with some touches on plot monitoring as well as TxDOT's conservation measures. So broadly speaking, what land should you enroll? Well, any land where monarchs are reasonably expected to occur, as well as where maintenance or construction activities could reasonably be expected to cause a take of monarchs or a loss of habitat, which would result in a take. Of course, that's what Dan and Phil had just talked about, and we won't get into that too much here. But as you can see, this is just a map from Journey North. Monarchs occur across the whole state of Texas. There are some places where the density looks to be a bit lower, but it's important that we consider the limitations of citizen science there. Just because there aren't many monarchs spotted in the El Paso region doesn't necessarily mean anything because of how low the population density of humans is there. If you have a county that has a couple thousand people, it's very likely that not one of them even knows what Journey North is. So with that being said, and just the few points that we have, even in those more rural areas, monarchs can really occur across the entire state. So for TxDOT, it was a no-brainer that we had to enroll all of our land, our whole system. Because again, across our land, the monarchs can be found almost everywhere, and construction and maintenance activities will occur across our whole system. And this picture on the right is just a little snapshot of our system. Those blue dots are just cities, and then the roadways are in that purple color. So now in our case, we've determined that we want to enroll all of our land. In your case, you might determine we only want to enroll a portion. Maybe there's some geographic constraints that are going to affect where monarchs occur. But for us, it was everywhere. So we know we want to enroll all of our land. How do we actually figure out what all of our land is? We couldn't find a singular database tracking the location and acreage of every single parcel of land that is owned or controlled or managed by TxDOT. I talked with many different divisions that we have, and there wasn't one singular resource like that that would allow us to say we have exactly, 1,100,374 acres or something like that. So we had to give it our best estimate. I did that using ArcGIS. With a system this large, it probably wouldn't be possible to do that with paper maps. But using ArcGIS was very helpful. I know Iris and Dan have talked about this in the past, that it's not necessary, but it probably would, benefit you greatly. In our case, it made the process a lot easier. So we had some existing knowledge, literature, that stated that TxDOT controls, manages, owns around 1.1 to 1.2 million acres. So using that existing knowledge, we could make that estimate using ArcGIS and essentially be able to tell, is this estimate accurate? To do this, what we needed was a map of a roadway system, or for anyone in the transmission or the utility industry, you would need a map of your right-of-ways with some sort of centerline features. In our case, that feature would be the center lane miles, which is actually what the map of roadways is. So we had our on-system map of roadways, and then we sort of just have to make an assumption on the average right-of-way width. How I did this was by generating random points on the right-of-way across the state. I only used 100. If you wanted a larger sample size, you could go 1,000, but using this method, you will be measuring it by hand, so that might be pretty extensive work. But I do think for the estimation purposes of this, 100 was good enough. We have a very high quality base map layer that we can import into ArcGIS, which allows us to measure the right of way from edge to edge, and it's a pretty accurate result. So I took my 100 points. I used the measuring tool within ArcGIS to measure the right of way from edge to edge. That includes your roadside, your paved surface, your center median, everything in between there. So when we find the average width of all points, I removed results outside of 2 standard deviations, because I think about 6 of those 100 points got placed on clover leaf interchanges, but those certainly do not make up 6% of our whole system. So the bell curve sort of was weighted pretty far in one direction, which didn't really make sense and would have probably yielded us way over enrolling, more land than we actually have. But once you have those standard deviations removed, if you opt to do that, you can just multiply your assumed average width, which I converted to miles, by the center lane miles of roadways, and that yielded a number of 1.238 million acres, which is very, very close to that existing knowledge that we had about how much land TxDOT actually owns or manages. So that's how we got a sort of accurate estimate of our lands. And once you have your estimate of how much land you're enrolling, you're going to want to figure out of that, how much do you have to adopt, and then where do you want to adopt, things like that. So for highways and interstates, per the CCAA, we have an 8% minimum adoption rate. So that means for 1.238 million enrolled acres, we would need to adopt at least 99,040 acres. However, TxDOT's conservation measures are already being applied to essentially our whole system, and they have been for decades. We're not having to implement some new expensive process to enroll in the CCAA. And because of that, it allowed us to adopt much more than the minimum amount of acreage. And as you can see on the right, this is essentially our map of what the final roadways are that ended up being included in our adopted acreage. Basically, it's just all of our roadways within 17 of our districts. And then there are some buffers subtracted from that for safety purposes, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So as I just mentioned, we chose to adopt land in 17 out of 25 districts. The main reason was that these districts are a big part of the central Monarch Flyway or the coastal Flyway. And the other 8 districts that we chose not to adopt were very far, seeing as that currently it is just our section out of Austin that is doing the plot monitoring. It wouldn't make sense to drive 10 hours to El Paso to assess a single plot if we had one monitoring plot put there. So those are sort of the 2 main reasons that we chose to adopt land in these 17 districts. But once we had picked those 17, we isolated the districts the roadways, from those 17 districts. And then we again multiplied that by the assumed average right-of-way width. And that gave us our initial number of how much land are we going to adopt. But because of safety purposes, we did put a buffer around cities because we don't want to be in the middle of a busy city doing a plot assessment. So what we did was, if the population of a city was greater than 10,000, we put a 15-mile buffer. But there are still smaller cities or towns that are included in that. Based on what I've seen from the plot assessments this year, we're going to want to put a smaller buffer around even those smaller cities as well, again, just for safety purposes. It ended up that we got a lot of our random plots being placed within city limits, and we want to be as safe as possible when we are doing these plot assessments. So that's sort of experimental as of right now, but for next year's adopted acreage, we may alter that a little bit so that we're not having to do assessments within city limits. And as basically for the reason But once we got that number, we subtracted our buffers, then we took our total lane miles, not our center lane miles, but our total lane miles within the remaining area, and we multiplied that by the average lane width, which is a statistic we had on our roadways map. Then we could subtract the actual paved surfaces from our adopted acreage, because of course we are not actually doing the conservation measures on the pavement, we're doing it on the roadsides. But after we had done all this, this yielded us a total adopted acreage of just under 450,000 acres. And here you can just see this is a picture of the city buffers that we included. Of course, in areas like Dallas, extremely high population density, almost all of our Dallas district there is covered by those city buffers. So there'll be a more limited selection of roads in that district where our random plot assessments could be assigned. And that's very much the same reason why we didn't include somewhere like the Houston district. The entire district would have just been covered by city buffers because it's so densely populated. But here's what the final roadways look like with the city buffers. Those red roadways are everything that is currently being included in our adopted acreage, and the blue buffers are the locations where we would not be assessing plots for safety reasons. So now we've sort of figured out what our enrolled land is as well as what our adopted land is, but what do we do on that land? Just a little bit of TxDOT's background. Well, number one of our conservation measures is wildflower seeding. We do wildflower seeding sort of freehand just to seed wildflowers. Also on our construction and maintenance projects, we do wildflower seeding. We have an integrated vegetation management program, which includes native planting, which includes grasses and wildflowers, targeted herbicide treatments, and mowing. Our mowing policy is a really big part of this. So with our mowing policy, we delay mowing until wildflowers have set seed, unless safety issues dictate otherwise. We also do a final fall mow to promote the germination and growth of wildflowers for future years. And our mowing cycles are very limited, whereas in certain cases, DOTs may mow 12 times a year, once a month. Most areas in Texas are only mowed twice a year. And then public outreach, that would sort of fall as a supplementary measure, but we do a lot of public outreach as well. We give out wildflower seed packets, and that helps spread education about flowers, and also provides a nectar source for monarchs on private land, because people will be planting those in their backyard or wherever. So we're not only getting that seeding done on the state's right-of-ways, it's getting done on private property as well. We also have Wildflower Guides to educate people on what we commonly see on the right-of-ways and what we consider desirable. And we do a lot of public talks as well to groups such as the Master Gardeners or Naturalists, different municipalities, NGOs, and those are just some of the things that are TxDOT's either conservation or supplementary measures that we've enrolled in the CCAA. And since we talked a little bit about the conservation measures, we want to talk a little bit about tracking the land and conservation measures, because tracking is another big part of it. For us, it's going to be fairly simple. As I spoke about before, there's not just a singular database of every single piece of owned land. So we're going to do more of a yearly estimate strategy on our land tracking, essentially. So what we'll do is have our roadways map that is published every year, and based off of what those roadways are, we can then determine what our adopted acreage and enrolled acreage will be for that year if it happens to change. And again, we'll use that assumed average right-of-way width and multiply it by the center lane miles of roadways to show how much land we have, and then the map itself shows where that land is located. So as far as tracking conservation measures goes, our measures are not projected to change from year to year because they've been the same for many years, and they're projected to continue to be the same. So as far as our targeted herbicide treatments, our mowing protocols, our wildflower seeding, those shouldn't change from year to year, and neither will the locations. They all occur across for all intents and purposes, the whole of our system. Of course, with wildflower seeding, we're not seeding 1.238 million acres per year, but it can be expected that that seeding is going to occur, I don't want to say randomly, but it will occur across the entirety of the system. So in our cases, it would more or less be something like reporting we seeded maybe 10,000 acres as an example this year. That's not the true number, but just as an example, we seeded 10,000 acres, and those acres fall into this category. Maybe it was a maintenance project, a construction project, maybe it was hand seeding, maybe it was grill seeding. We could report on all of that. And then since we talked about that as well, we want to talk about plot monitoring, because of course conservation measures are one thing, but we actually need to do that biological effectiveness monitoring. Again, our adopted acreage was limited to 17 districts, and that was because we have a very large system and it will reduce the travel time to monitor plots. The plots were randomly generated in ArcGIS, and that was a very complicated process because with such a large system, my laptop actually couldn't use the random point generation tool. It would just crash the program. So what we had to do was have a different protocol for getting that random generation. I'm not going to go into that today because we're sort of limited on time, but if anyone has questions about that, feel free to send me an email or something. My contact info is at the end. But all plots we have monitored so far have passed. They have met the criteria for suitable habitat based on the CCAA. I was actually just out monitoring plots yesterday, and I got one of the plots with 50 plus stems of milkweed. We're actually using a modified tier 2 scorecard. I made my own Survey 123 app for that, and I made some small modifications to it, but for the most part, it's reflective of that tier 2 scorecard, and it has all the necessary components to report on for CCAA compliance. And that's just sort of a quick rundown of how we went about enrolling and adopting land in the CCAA, as well as a little bit about our conservation measures and our plot monitoring. If anyone has questions, I don't know if Iris, if we want to open it up to a Q&A or something like that, but that's my contact information for any questions. Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Sam. Yeah, so we do have some time here, about like 4 or 5 minutes for questions. I see there've been a couple chats as well, but as I pulled those up, if there's anyone who wants to ask a question over the phone, feel free.
Sam, I had a question. This is Stacy Molds with Virginia DOT. When you talk about safety and avoiding the cities, are you just meaning safety for being able to safely pull over on the right of way for the people that are doing the monitoring? Is that what you mean? Yeah, that's correct. TxDOT is very safety first. So we don't want to be put into a situation where we're monitoring, say, in the middle of a 12-lane highway in the middle of Houston or something like that. It can be very unsafe for employees. So we want to make sure that we provide that safety. Okay. Does that sort of answer what you were asking about? Yeah, I mean, for us, we're only enrolling our interstates. So, I'm concerned about safety because I'm going to be doing the monitoring. But anyways, just curious. Yeah, absolutely. We enrolled our interstates as well as our other types of roads. And while we didn't specifically avoid the interstates, we did sort of want to avoid the cities because it could pose a safety hazard. So that's sort of why we went that route. Okay, thanks. Building upon that, Sam, we had a question too. Can you clarify? So you excluded the cities just from your adopted acres, but you've included them in your overall enrolled lands. Is that correct? Yeah, that's correct. Our entire system is currently what's enrolled, but we've excluded the cities from the adopted acreage so that we are not going to be getting randomly generated plots within cities. That's basically what it comes down to.
Okay. Okay. And I'm curious, kind of one thought that I had as you were sharing that too, Sam, and Dan, I'm going to ask for your input on this too, is I'm thinking particularly for an organization who is trying to get every single adopted acre they can to meet their minimum target. If there was an organization that wanted to include adopted acres in cities or urban areas, but wanted to create some sort of filter that for safety reasons wouldn't randomly select a monitoring point in those urban spaces, would that be acceptable, do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I think if you can focus, yeah, there's probably there's some GIS nuances there if you do it there, but if you're limiting it to adopted acres, those are areas where you're doing the habitat work. So yeah, keeping those focused on those particular locations where you have potential habitat in urban areas. You know, you probably, to your point about safety, you know, set some other criteria on what sites might be suitable to monitor, you know, and then randomize within those constraints. I think there's ways you can do that.
Okay. There was another question from Von Seal about who's performing the monitoring at Texas DOT.
Yeah, so as of right now, or so far, I should say, it's just been myself, but other members of our section may also be stepping in. Right now, it's very hard with COVID. We more or less can't travel, so that is sort of one restriction we have. But in future years, it may be myself and other members of our group, as well as some people who work in our environmental division, our field biologists. But for so far, it's just been myself, yeah.
Sam, this is Tim Lohner with AEP. We have a very large system. We actually have a lot of transmission lines in Texas. I may not have caught this, but when you said talking about your monitoring, that you've limited the monitoring to certain districts, we're kind of faced with the same issue. We're in 11 different states and we're really spread out. And when you talk about efficiencies and establishing your monitoring sites, were those spans geographically, or not spans, I'm sorry, those districts, are they still broadly distributed geographically, or are they localized in some way that facilitates your monitoring?
So I would say that they are broadly distributed geographically, because they encompass the bulk of, I don't even want to say central Texas, but most of the state. It's really just mostly areas far to the north, far to the east, or far to the west that were not included. So in that sense, you could say they're localized to provide for easier and, you know, more possible travel to those locations for monitoring. The reason we sort of chose to adopt which districts that we did is because they broadly followed the Monarch's Central Flyway and Coastal Flyway. And since those were areas that were likely to see more Monarch traffic, we felt it would be appropriate to enroll those areas while excluding some of the areas that were farther away and also may have less Monarch traffic.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
We have another question here, and I know we're at time, so we'll wrap up here shortly. But Phil, if you're still on the phone, Brian raised a question about whether or not the Fish and Wildlife Service is conducting any monitoring of milkweed or nectar plants themselves to inform the listing decision. Do you know?
No, I think we're relying on other on information from other sources. There might be some work done in refuges, but that I'm not aware of.
Okay. Okay, excellent. Well, again, since we're at time today, we'll wrap up. Sam, I want to thank you again for preparing the presentation and sharing your case study. Sam did provide his contact information. Let's see if I can get to the previous slide here. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to him. And we will also make a recording of this case study available on the website. So stay tuned for that. And again, thanks everyone for good discussion today. We'll send out the poll here after the call. So if you didn't have a chance to respond to that enrollment poll, you'll have a chance to before the end of the day. And again, we'll be sending out minutes and any other follow-up items as needed. So thanks again for your time. Have a good afternoon.